Okay, here's a test. If you want to grow 10 pounds of bass in your 1 acre farm pond, how many pounds of forage do you have to grow? 100. And it's also got to be, obviously, of the appropriate size for the bass you have. Bass can eat a bluegill about 1/3 its length. So if you've got a pond full of 12-inch bass and all you've got is 8-inch bluegill, which isn't a bad thing, by the way, but from a forage standpoint, being available for those bass to eat, it's not too good a thing. So, you not only have to grow that 100 pounds of forage, it's got to be of the appropriate size. So what if you've got 10 pounds of bass and 100 pounds of forage in a 1 acre pond? Would you consider that a low level of production, or a medium level, or a high level? What would you rate that? 1 acre pond. Where would 100 pounds of fish standing crop per surface acre rate in your mind? Low? Pretty kind of average. I mean, that's not much management, which is what we're all about today. My definition of bass management is shortening the time between bites. That's pretty simple. But what if we want to intensively manage that pond, which I'm assuming you want to do since you're here today? We've got some techniques that we can use to increase the carrying capacity. Now, what do I mean by that? I want to go beyond that 100 pounds per acre. If I want to grow 30 pounds of bass per acre, I'm going to need to jack that system up to where it'll carry 300 to 400 pounds of forage, something in that neighborhood. I'm always amazed that somebody goes and fishes and, well, I'm going to do my neighbor a favor and stock several live wells full of bass into their pond. Fish populations seek their own level. And if that additional bass population you introduce doesn't have the forage to support it, guess what? There's other reasons you need to avoid stocking live wells full of fish from well-intended buddies, but that's the main one we'll stick to today. So we've got some options here that we can affect the carrying capacity of your pond. And feeding and fertilization are two of those techniques. Let's start with fertilization. Basically, if you're in the bass growing business, you want to be in the phytoplankton growing business. Remember Dr. Masters' ecology talk? We get that phytoplankton going, that translates to zooplankton and right on up that food chain to forage, and then ultimately to the fish that we want to catch, that predator, the bass. And so, if you're in the beef cattle business, you're a grass farmer. Pure and simple. You're in the bass growing business, you want to be a phytoplankton farmer. At least that's one opportunity to increase carrying capacity. The fertilization world is fraught with dangers. People call and they say, well, I'm going to fertilize. Well, the first thing here in East Texas, I say, well, wait a minute. That's a great idea, but we've got a laundry list of things to talk about before you start dumping fertilizer into that pond. And we'll go through some of these. Dr. Master mentioned occasionally you get an inherently rich pond that may not need fertilization. It's got that nice light green color to it throughout the growing season. That's a rarity, but it does happen. So let's look at some of these. He talked about the pH range, 6 to 9.5. Total alkalinity, at least 20 parts per million. For those of y'all in the acid counties of East Texas, his example was east of I-45. Every county extension agent has a pH and alkalinity test kit. If you're intent on managing your fish population, you need to have a water sample tested, whether you have them tested or send a sample to A&M. But I don't care how great a fish you stock and what all else you do, if you don't have good water quality, as he outlined for you, you're not going to achieve your goals. Same thing with fertility. We have to make sure our pH and alkalinity are in that go range before our fertilizer does it good, but there's a lot of other things that'll affect it as well. If you're low in alkalinity, below 20 parts per million, we're going to add ag lime. The amount of ag lime depends on how low below 20 parts per million you are. The nice thing about ag lime is fairly cheap. It's just ground rock. But calcium carbonate, the primary constituent of ag lime typically becomes insoluble at pHs above 8.3. So if we make a recommendation of 2 tons to the acre, but the dealer will only sell you a truckload of 5 tons per acre, not a problem. It's one of the few things, probably the only thing, if a little bit's good, in the acid waters of East Texas, a lot's better. As long as you're using ag lime just like you'd spread on your pasture. So we're going to start with a water test if you're from East Texas to make sure you're in that go range. And Dr. Master indicated you get the best results, the better you spread that lime throughout the entire lake. But then somebody gets the idea to fertilize a pond that looks like peanut butter. Remember, we're trying to induce growth in a plant that needs sunlight. And if you've got water the color of peanut butter, you're not going to get much light transmission below the surface. And so if you've got a muddy pond, you either have to take those steps to clear, with clear being a relative term, and I want swimming pool clear water, but to a depth of about 15 to 24 inches, typically, before you can add that fertilizer. So you may have to take steps to clear the pond, or look at an alternative. If clearing the pond, perhaps you don't control that watershed that's eroding and washing into your pond, something like that. You can't control all that. But this is a no-go. You lose all that sedimentation, topsoil into your pond. If it's clay-based, it's going to stay muddy. And that's not good for bass production either, because bass have to sea to make a living. Not only is it infertile, it impacts those fish's ability to feed on the prey fish or forage that's actually there. So you got to address that. Now, here's another test question. Would you want to jump in with Dr. Masters alum and gypsum and lime and clear that pond as step 1?
No.
What would step 1 be? You got a problem up here, don't you? If you don't deal with that, you're just putting a Band-Aid on it. So if you've got a muddy pond, you've got to address that. So as I said, bass have to seed it, make a living. If it's muddy, you've got to take steps to clear it, or if it's already a heavy algal bloom or a bloom there, it may be inherent fertility that's present driving that. We don't want crystal clear water. That's infertile, and that can create some additional problems, the most common of which you'll run into would be weeds. Should you always clear your pond? Well, for bass, it's got to have some degree of clarity, but you may have to look at an alternative, maybe going with single species management. We're talking about bass mostly today, but obviously y'all have some ponds that may be better suited for fish like catfish that you could manage for. And on these ponds over an acre versus your smaller ponds, if you really want to manage for bass, you've got to have that some degree of water clarity. I'm not going to go too much into this because Dr. Masters already covered it, but you don't want to fertilize a muddy pond. That's the bottom line. The question came up earlier about excessive flow through. You can't keep your nutrients intact if you've got water running over that spillway constantly. Now that's a good thing coming out of the drought of 2011, but it also makes it difficult to keep those nutrients in there long enough for that bloom to develop. One thing that can help is if you've got a water release structure on that pond to where it's removing excess water off the bottom instead of that higher quality water running around the side of the dam through the spillway, this is a better situation. And you can maintain that bloom. Your most productive water in your pond or lake is that top 4, 5, 6 feet of water. Most productive by far, because that's where your photosynthetic activities occur. So if you've got the opportunity to install a bottom release structure, this is a much better way to move water out of your pond than having it just run around the spillway. Plus, it makes it a little easier to keep that water in there where you get your bloom established if fertility's a go. Aquatic vegetation. How many of y'all have heard that if you've got aquatic weeds growing in your pond, you can fertilize them and get rid of them? Wrong. You're just going to grow more weeds. It's very much a timing issue if you can establish that bloom prior to weed growth this time of year. Then that sunlight is blocked, and some of your submergent species, what many of you call moss, can't get the sunlight it needs, and so you can suppress that growth. But if you wait until the weeds are already actively growing, they're going to compete for those nutrients with the phytoplankton. So the time to fertilize is now. When we start getting into that 65, 68 degree water temperature, we're there, 70 degrees certainly. And so typically most years, depending on where you are in the state, it's a big state, but somewhere, give or take, around April 1st. Sometimes as much as 2 weeks either way. But you've got to make sure you don't have some of these other issues of muddy water, excessive flow through, good pH and alkalinity, those sorts of things, before you start putting fertilizer in. And there's some cases of, we can make weed problems worse. So what are your choices? Well, we've got a lot of choices. In the olden days, those who have been around a long time, remember the granular fertilizer that you went out there and you created submerged platforms beneath the water surface in 2 or 3 feet of water, and you broke open that 16-16-4 or 20-20-5 at 80 to 100 pounds per acre, and all these rates and so forth are in your CD or they're on the containers themselves per surface acre, and you let that slowly absorb into the water. That provided the fuel for that phytoplankton to go. Then liquid fertilizer came along, and that was a godsend because it was so much easier to apply. And then the third generation has been the water-soluble powders, which are even easier to apply. So we've made great strides in fertilization. But you need one of these. It's called a Secchi disc. And you can make one or you can buy one. I've cut out the bottoms of a jillion Purex jugs and left the strip running up the side and stapled it to a yardstick so you could see. But the only way you're going to be able to monitor that phytoplankton response to that fertility application is to measure visibility with a Secchi disc. And it may be 2 weeks between applications, or you may go 4 weeks. It's weather driven in many cases, but you're going to need to read the water to know when to fertilize. And fertilize is not a one-shot deal in the spring. If you're just going to dump fertilizer in now, that's going to be it. Don't bother. It is a growing season long process, and you may apply 3 applications, or you may apply 5 or 6 applications throughout the growing season to maintain that light green color and get Secchi disc reading somewhere in that 18 to 24 inch range, and when it starts clearing much beyond that, you know it's time to make a reduced rate application. And by doing that, you can double or triple the pounds of fish that your pond will support. Now, what happens if we fertilize and do a good job this year and we just don't feel like it next year? We have created a response by increasing the carrying capacity and doubled or tripled our fish production and put them on a Jenny Craig diet when we fail to follow up that next year. So fertilization is a commitment. It is a great tool to increase carrying capacity, but you got to be willing to do it right to get the bang for the buck. But few things have the return on investment that a fertility program will give you. And you can see we're going down, and when you can't differentiate between the white and the black quadrants on there, then you measure that level of visibility and you record it and you follow that and you measure it the same place every time you measure it in the lake, so you were consistent. And that's your guide to when to go back in with more fertilizer. And typically the second, third, fourth applications are a reduced rate below the first. But you maintain that light green color, that's your guide. And we're going down and we're going down, and just about a little past there, you can't differentiate any longer, and you're there. And you read your visibility. It's a whole lot better to quantify it using this rather than just trying to look down the water and seeing how far you can see. And again, if you've got a spare Purex jug, and in a pinch, a Clorox jug will do. Okay? All right, the other way that we can enhance carrying capacity is through supplemental feeding. And we do this with catfish ponds, and we can drive these systems from carrying 100 pounds to the acre to often 1,000 pounds or more. We use a floating fish ration. Oftentimes we try to use a smaller pellet for supplementing our bass forage than for catfish because of the mouth size. Our forage species like bluegill just can't eat as large a pellet. But use a floating ration Give them all they'll eat in 10 or 15 minutes. Some people like to use a floating ring of some sort to keep the feed inside so the fish can come up underneath and get to it. But this is the main critter we're trying to supplement when we feed. It's bluegill. And Dr. Master talked about the bluegill. Now, how are you going to differentiate bluegill from them there perch he mentioned? All right, when you get back to your pond, little black or blue ear flap, vertical bars running up and down the sides, and back here on the rear of the top or the dorsal fin, there'll be a black or blue ink blotch. You will not be successful with your bass population if you don't have bluegill. And if you can drive that bluegill population with a fertilizer program or a feeding program, indirectly, that's what impacts your bass population. Automatic feeders, if you're feeding bluegill or tilapia, if you supplemented your bluegill as forage with tilapia, they also use the pelleted ration very well. A floating feeder works, floating ration feeder works very well. You can see the feeding ring. Bluegill can't eat as much as a catfish can at a single feeding, so set that thing to go off at least twice a day, early in the morning, late in the evening. 3 times a day is fine. Set it to where they're able to eat everything that you're putting out there in about 10 or 15 minutes. If there's feed left on the water, you need to cut it back. But you can really enhance your bluegill populations. It's perfect for those lakes that have too much flow through, that you can't get a fertility program established. And I like to put at least one feeder for about 10 acres. Lots of different brands. I'm sure some of the folks next door have different types, but don't use a deer feeder because feeding shelled corn is a lot different than feeding a floating fish ration. So buy one that's made for fish. Great tool, even if you are fertilizing. A lot of people go ahead and supplement by feeding. There's other things out there that like that floating feed too, and so they'll come to the dinner bell as well, ducks included. So, we're now beginning to get into some of this management to where you're going to start driving that system to produce what you need to produce with the ultimate goal of growing more bass. And so feeding and fertility are 2 great ways to start that process.